Johnny Carson revealed the golden age stars who slept their way to the top. For 30 years, Johnny Carson invited America into his late-night world, sharing laughs and conversations with the biggest stars in Hollywood. But when the cameras stopped rolling and the audience went home, Carson often continued those conversations in his office, with the microphones off and the truth filters removed. It was in these unguarded moments that Hollywood's most carefully constructed myths unraveled. Stars who presented wholesome public images would reveal shocking secrets about the industry's darker realities. And no topic generated more candid revelations than the transactional relationships that built and destroyed careers in Golden Age Hollywood. Johnny knew everyone's secrets, revealed a former NBC executive who worked closely with Carson during his late-night reign. Stars would tell him things they'd never say publicly, especially after a few drinks at his famous post-show gatherings, and what they revealed about how Hollywood really worked would have shocked middle America to its core. Carson developed a reputation as the industry's most trusted confidant, creating a safe space where Hollywood legends could acknowledge the uncomfortable truths behind their carefully crafted public narratives. When conversations turned to how careers were really made during the studio era, the stories revealed a system where talent was often secondary to sexual availability. Carson understood the gap between Hollywood's public image and its private reality better than anyone, explained a former Tonight Show producer. He knew which careers were built on genuine talent and which ones were built in the bedroom. And while he maintained discretion on air, in private he was unflinching about the casting couch culture that defined the studio system. Tonight, we reveal the shocking conversations Johnny Carson had behind closed doors about 8 Golden Age stars whose paths to fame involved much more than just acting ability. These aren't just rumors or speculation, but insights from the man who served as Hollywood's ultimate confessor and confidant. The truth about who really slept their way to the top and the price they paid for their success. Before she was Marilyn Monroe, she was a struggling actress who couldn't get in the door. What she did next shocked even Johnny Carson, who later revealed every role she won came with a private performance first.
Yes, I'm much happier though. I'm very pleased. Is it true that you
1. Marilyn Monroe, the icon built through calculated affairs. When Marilyn Monroe graced Johnny Carson's Tonight Show couch in the early 1960s, America saw the quintessential blonde bombshell, glamorous, flirtatious, and seemingly born for stardom. But Carson, with his extraordinary ability to see beyond carefully crafted public personas, recognized a much more complicated truth about Monroe's path to fame. In private conversations with close associates, Carson reportedly revealed what industry insiders had long known, but publicly denied. Monroe's meteoric rise from anonymous model to global superstar had been facilitated by strategic relationships with powerful men who could advance her career. She smiled on stage, but she was exhausted off it, Carson allegedly confided to a producer after one of Monroe's appearances. Every significant break in her career came from a man who wanted something in return. First it was photographers, then agents, then studio executives. That's Hollywood's dirty little secret. Talent opens the door a crack, but for many women, especially then, it took something else to push it all the way open. According to those privy to Carson's private assessments, he had learned through his extensive network of industry connections about Monroe's rumored affairs with top executives at multiple studios, including the notoriously predatory Darryl F. Zanuck at 20th Century Fox. These weren't random romantic entanglements, but calculated steps on her path to stardom. Carson wasn't judging her, clarified a former Tonight Show staff member who witnessed several of Carson's post-show discussions about Monroe. He saw her as someone who understood the rules of a corrupt system and played them to her advantage. He actually respected her strategic mind. The public saw the breathless blonde, but Johnny recognized the calculating intelligence beneath that persona. What made Monroe's story particularly fascinating to Carson was how she transformed what began as exploitation into a form of power. While early in her career, she may have been pressured into relationships with men who controlled her professional future, she eventually learned to wield her sexuality as a tool to advance her interests in an industry structured to limit women's agency. Johnny believed Marilyn eventually flipped the script, explained a colleague who worked with Carson during the 1970s. She started out being exploited by the system, but ended up exploiting it right back. The tragedy, as Johnny saw it, was how this transactional approach to relationships affected her ability to form genuine connections. By the time she achieved real power in Hollywood, the line between performance and authenticity had completely blurred for her. Carson's insights into Monroe's strategic relationships weren't merely speculation. They were informed by conversations with directors, producers, and fellow actors who had witnessed firsthand how the studio system operated during Hollywood's golden age. The casting couch wasn't an occasional aberration, but an institutionalized practice that determined which aspiring actresses would receive opportunities and which would remain anonymous. What fascinated Carson about Monroe's story wasn't just that she had played this game, noted a former NBC executive, but how it had both created and ultimately destroyed her. He saw her as the perfect example of Hollywood's corrupting influence, someone who achieved everything she thought she wanted, but lost herself in the process. Joan Crawford didn't just sleep her way to the top, she weaponized it. Carson revealed how the actress kept detailed records of her powerful conquests, turning Hollywood's exploitation system against itself.
The image will take care of itself. But I played the career women long before that. That owner of the truck drivers, you remember?
2. Joan Crawford, from factory worker to boardroom power. Few Hollywood transformations impressed Johnny Carson more than Joan Crawford's extraordinary journey from impoverished factory worker to Academy Award-winning superstar and Pepsi-Cola executive. Behind the scenes, Carson shared insights about Crawford that revealed how she had strategically used relationships with both men and women to ascend Hollywood's brutal hierarchy. She didn't climb the ladder, she owned it, Carson reportedly quipped to his inner circle after one of Crawford's Tonight Show appearances. This wasn't mere admiration for Crawford's professional accomplishments, but acknowledgement of how skillfully she had navigated a system designed to exploit women like her. According to those familiar with Carson's private conversations, he had learned through industry sources about Crawford's early years in Hollywood when she allegedly formed strategic relationships with influential directors, producers, and studio executives who could advance her career. Unlike many actresses who were victimized by the casting couch system, Crawford reportedly approached these relationships with clear-eyed pragmatism. Johnny believed Crawford was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers, explained a former Tonight Show producer. According to what he'd heard from old Hollywood players, she kept meticulous mental notes about which relationships advanced her career and which didn't. She wasn't just sleeping with powerful men, she was building a network of influence that eventually made her more powerful than many of the men who had initially exploited her. Particularly intriguing to Carson were the rumors about Crawford's strategic relationships with women as well as men. In an era when homosexuality remained strictly concealed in Hollywood, Crawford reportedly developed close relationships with influential women who controlled access to certain directors or social circles. These weren't necessarily sexual relationships in all cases, but they reflected Crawford's understanding that power in Hollywood wasn't exclusively held by men. Carson once said that what made Crawford different was her refusal to be anyone's victim, recalled a staff writer who worked on The Tonight Show during the 1970s. She understood early on that in the studio system, sex was currency. Instead of fighting that reality, she mastered it, treating her relationships as strategic alliances rather than romantic entanglements. This calculated approach extended beyond Crawford's rise to stardom. According to Carson's private assessments, she maintained her power in Hollywood long past the age when most actresses were discarded by cultivating relationships with gossip columnists, critics, and eventually corporate executives outside the traditional studio structure. Her marriage to Pepsi CEO Alfred Steele represented the culmination of this strategy, a relationship that gave her influence in the business world when her Hollywood power began to wane. Johnny saw Crawford as the ultimate Hollywood survivor, noted the former NBC executive. He told colleagues she was one of the few stars who fully understood the game from the beginning and refused to be broken by it. While other actresses were destroyed by the transactional nature of Hollywood relationships, Crawford somehow maintained enough emotional detachment to use those same dynamics to her advantage. Carson's behind-the-scenes insights about Crawford reflected his broader understanding of how the studio system functioned, a world where talent was necessary but insufficient, and where strategic personal relationships often determined who received opportunities and who was left behind. Crawford's story, as Carson understood it, represented both the corruption of this system and the possibility of navigating it without being destroyed.
In a picture you're going to see, Cary Grant asks her if her motor is running. Well, It was running on.
America's most masculine heartthrob was hiding Hollywood's biggest secret. Carson knew the truth about Rock Hudson's arrangement with the studios and the powerful men he had to please to protect his career and his life. 3. Rock Hudson, the fabricated heterosexual. Few Hollywood deceptions fascinated Johnny Carson more than the elaborate fiction constructed around Rock Hudson's public image. As one of the industry's most bankable leading men during the 1950s and 60s, Hudson projected an ideal of rugged heterosexual masculinity on screen while hiding his homosexuality from public view. Behind the scenes, Carson accumulated insights about the complex and sometimes troubling compromises Hudson made to maintain this charade. Rock wasn't straight, but his ambition was, Carson reportedly told a producer during a private conversation in the 1970s. This pithy observation captured the essence of Hudson's predicament. A gay man whose career depended on convincing America he was the epitome of heterosexual appeal. According to those familiar with Carson's private discussions, he had learned through industry connections about the extraordinary measures taken to protect Hudson's secret, including arranged dates with women, a sham marriage to his agent's secretary, and studio-generated stories about fictional romances with female co-stars. These weren't just spontaneous deceptions, but a carefully orchestrated campaign directed by Hudson's agent Henry Wilson and studio executives who had invested millions in his heterosexual image. Johnny was particularly intrigued by the industrial-scale deception involved in creating Rock's public persona, explained a former Tonight Show staff writer. He told colleagues it wasn't just about hiding Hudson's sexuality, it was about manufacturing an entirely fictional heterosexual identity, complete with fabricated romantic history, staged photo opportunities, and paid female companions for public events. Most troubling to Carson were the rumors he had heard about Hudson's early career and the nature of his relationship with Henry Wilson, the agent who discovered him and transformed the truck driver Roy Scherer Jr. into the movie star Rock Hudson. According to Hollywood insiders who spoke candidly with Carson, Wilson was known for demanding sexual favors from his young male clients in exchange for representation and career advancement. Carson believed Hudson had made a Faustian bargain early in his career, said the former NBC executive. Based on what he'd heard from multiple sources, Johnny understood that Hudson's initial break into Hollywood likely involved sexual relationships with Wilson and possibly other powerful men who could advance his career. This wasn't just about hiding his sexuality, it was about submitting to exploitation as the price of opportunity. This dynamic reflected the double bind faced by gay actors in the studio era. They could either hide their true selves and potentially succeed, or live authentically and almost certainly sacrifice their careers. For Hudson, the choice to pursue stardom meant accepting a life of constant deception, with studio publicists, agents, and executives all participating in an elaborate fiction designed to protect their investment in his heterosexual appeal. Johnny saw Hudson's story as one of the most tragic in Hollywood, noted a colleague who worked closely with Carson. He had achieved everything he'd wanted professionally, but at the cost of authentic personal relationships. Even at the height of his fame, when he was one of the biggest stars in the world, he lived in fear that his true self would be discovered and everything would come crashing down. Carson's interest in Hudson's story wasn't prurient, but reflected his broader fascination with the gap between Hollywood's carefully constructed public narratives and the messy, complicated realities they concealed. Hudson's case represented perhaps the most extreme example of this disconnection, a man whose entire public identity was fabricated to conform to societal expectations and studio commercial interests. What Carson found most revealing about Hudson's situation wasn't just the personal deception, explained the former staff writer, but how many people were complicit in maintaining it. Studio heads, producers, co-stars, journalists. Dozens of people knew the truth but participated in the lie because they had financial interests in preserving his heterosexual image. It exposed the fundamentally corrupt nature of the entire publicity system.
It's like crying out, why didn't someone guide me? Why didn't someone stop me? They could not have.
Her 7 marriages made headlines, but Carson knew Lana Turner's real romantic history was far more calculated. Every contract she signed came with unwritten terms, he told friends, and those terms made her one of Hollywood's most powerful women. 4. Lana Turner, the Sweater Girl's strategic seductions. When Lana Turner appeared on The Tonight Show during the 1960s and 70s, viewers saw a glamorous star whose tumultuous personal life including 7 marriages and the infamous stabbing of her lover Johnny Stompanato by her teenage daughter, had often overshadowed her acting career. But Johnny Carson, through his extensive Hollywood connections, understood a more complex truth about Turner's path to fame. She had 7 husbands. Hollywood was the 8th, Carson reportedly remarked to his inner circle after one of Turner's appearances. This observation wasn't just a clever quip, but a recognition of how Turner's romantic relationships, both public and private, had shaped her professional trajectory from her discovery at Schwab's Pharmacy, itself a Hollywood myth, to her status as one of MGM's most bankable stars. According to those privy to Carson's private assessments, he had learned through industry sources about Turner's strategic approach to relationships early in her career. What appeared to the public as a series of passionate romances often had calculated professional dimensions, with Turner reportedly forming relationships with men who could advance her standing at MGM and secure her better roles. Johnny believed Turner was much more strategic than her public image suggested, explained a former Tonight Show producer. Based on what he'd heard from old Hollywood players, many of her relationships, especially in her early career, were formed with a clear understanding of how they would benefit her professionally. This wasn't unique to Turner. It was how ambitious women survived in the studio system, but she was particularly skilled at leveraging personal relationships for career advancement. What distinguished Turner's approach, according to Carson's private insights, was her ability to transform what began as exploitation into a form of power. While initially subject to the same casting couch pressures as many young actresses, she quickly learned to be selective about her relationships, focusing on men who could provide specific professional advantages rather than merely responding to coercion. Carson saw Turner as someone who had mastered Hollywood's unwritten rules, noted the former NBC executive. He told colleagues she understood early on that in the studio system, romantic relationships weren't just personal matters, but business arrangements. Instead of fighting that reality, she embraced it and made it work to her advantage. This calculated approach reportedly extended to Turner's relationships with directors and co-stars, as well as studio executives. Carson had heard from multiple sources about how Turner would form strategic connections with powerful directors who could showcase her talents effectively, or male stars whose approval could help her secure better roles. These weren't necessarily long-term relationships, but often served specific professional purposes. Johnny admired her pragmatism, recalled a staff writer who worked on The Tonight Show during the 1970s. He once said Turner never confused romance with business. She approached her career with clear-eyed understanding of how Hollywood really worked and refused to pretend the system was meritocratic when she knew decisions were made for many reasons other than talent. Turner's approach reflected the limited options available to women in the studio system, where formal power was almost exclusively held by men. In this environment, strategic romantic relationships represented one of the few avenues through which actresses could influence decisions affecting their careers. While modern perspectives might question the authenticity of relationships formed partly for professional advantage, Carson reportedly understood these arrangements in the context of their time. What fascinated Carson about Turner's story was her refusal to be a passive participant in her own career, explained the former producer. In an era when actresses were often treated as interchangeable commodities, she found ways to assert agency and shape her professional trajectory. Her methods might raise eyebrows today, but they represented a form of resistance within a system designed to deny women control over their careers. Studio head Harry Cohn controlled every aspect of Rita Hayworth's career, including who she could date, how she looked, and which men she needed to entertain after hours. Carson called it Hollywood's most disturbing open secret. 5. Rita Hayworth, dancing to Columbia's controlling tune. Few Hollywood transformations were more dramatic than the evolution of Margarita Cancino into Rita Hayworth, the glamorous love goddess who became one of the most iconic stars of the 1940s. Behind this remarkable metamorphosis lay a disturbing story of control and exploitation that Johnny Carson came to understand through his conversations with Hollywood insiders who had witnessed it firsthand. She danced for the world, but one man called the music, Carson reportedly told close associates when discussing Hayworth's career. That man was Harry Cohn, the notoriously tyrannical head of Columbia Pictures, whose relationship with Hayworth represented one of Hollywood's most troubling examples of studio control over female stars. According to those familiar with Carson's private discussions, he had learned disturbing details about Cohn's micromanagement of virtually every aspect of Hayworth's life and career. This control began with her physical transformation, including painful electrolysis to raise her hairline and change her ethnic appearance, hair dye to transform her from brunette to redhead, and even changes to her name to obscure her Spanish heritage and extended to her personal relationships and daily activities. Johnny was disturbed by what he heard about Cohn's treatment of Hayworth, explained a former Tonight Show producer. Based on conversations with people who worked at Columbia during that era, he understood that Cohn essentially viewed Hayworth as his personal property. This wasn't just about controlling her professional opportunities, but about dictating who she could date, what social events she could attend, and even how she should conduct herself in private. Most troubling were the rumors Carson had heard about Cohn's practice of electronic surveillance. According to Hollywood insiders who spoke candidly with Carson, Cohn allegedly had Hayworth's home bugged so he could monitor her personal conversations and ensure she wasn't speaking negatively about the studio or forming relationships he didn't approve of. This extraordinary invasion of privacy reflected Cohn's determination to control every aspect of his most valuable female star's existence. Carson believed Hayworth's relationship with the studio went beyond the typical contractual arrangement into something more sinister, said the former NBC executive. From what he'd heard from multiple sources, Johnny understood that Hayworth's initial opportunities and continued success at Columbia came with unspoken expectations about her availability to Cohn and other powerful men he wished to impress or reward with her company. This arrangement reflected the extraordinary power studio heads wielded during Hollywood's golden age. Under the studio system, stars were bound by restrictive long-term contracts that gave executives like Cohn enormous control over their professional opportunities and public image. For female stars like Hayworth, refusing a studio head's demands, professional or personal, could result in suspension without pay, assignment to inferior projects, or even career destruction through strategic bad publicity. Johnny saw Hayworth as one of Hollywood's most tragic figures, noted a colleague who worked closely with Carson. He told friends she had essentially traded control of her life for fame and success, only to discover the price was far higher than she had anticipated. By the time she achieved enough stardom to push back against Cohn's control, the patterns of exploitation were already firmly established. Carson's interest in Hayworth's story stemmed from his broader fascination with the human cost of Hollywood stardom. Through his unique position as the entertainment world's most trusted confidant, he had accumulated insights about the gap between public perception and private reality for many stars. Hayworth's case represented perhaps the most extreme example of this disconnection. A woman worshipped as a goddess on screen while being controlled like property off it. What Carson found most revealing about Hayworth's situation wasn't just Cohn's exploitation, explained the former staff writer, but how many people were complicit in enabling it. Producers, directors, other executives, dozens of people witnessed his treatment of her, but remained silent because challenging Cohn could end their own careers. It exposed the fundamentally corrupt nature of the entire studio system. Tyrone Power's matinee idol image hid Hollywood's most dangerous secret. Carson revealed how the star navigated a treacherous double life, sleeping with producers of both genders while maintaining the facade that kept audiences buying tickets.
I don't know, you're probably suffering from shock and exposure.
Oh, no, just curiosity. You went to quite some pains to get...
6. Tyrone Power, the matinee idol's secret bargains. With his striking good looks and undeniable charisma, Tyrone Power embodied the classic Hollywood leading man during the 1930s and 40s, starring in swashbucklers and romances that cemented his status as one of the era's most bankable heartthrobs. But Johnny Carson, through private conversations with Hollywood veterans who knew the truth behind Power's carefully managed image, understood the complex reality of the star's rise to fame. The studio's golden boy, in more ways than one, Carson allegedly remarked to associates when discussing Power's career. This observation hinted at what Carson had learned about Power's strategic relationships with influential figures at 20th Century Fox and beyond, relationships that crossed gender lines and reflected the actor's pragmatic approach to career advancement. According to those familiar with Carson's private assessments, he had heard from multiple industry sources about Power's willingness to form beneficial relationships with both male and female power brokers who could influence his career trajectory. These weren't public romances, but discreet arrangements conducted with the full awareness of studio executives who valued Power's box office appeal while carefully protecting his heterosexual image. Johnny believed Power understood Hollywood's unwritten rules better than most, explained a former Tonight Show producer. Based on what he'd heard from old Hollywood insiders, Power recognized early in his career that his extraordinary good looks could be leveraged for professional advancement through strategic relationships with influential figures of both genders. While the public saw the dashing heterosexual romantic lead, the reality was considerably more complex. What distinguished Power's situation from some other cases, according to Carson's insights, was the tacit approval of the studio system. Unlike actors who hid their sexuality entirely, like Rock Hudson, Power reportedly operated with a certain understanding from studio heads who were aware of his private arrangements, but valued his commercial appeal enough to ensure those arrangements remained private. Carson saw Power as someone who had negotiated a complex compromise with the studio system, noted the former NBC executive. He told colleagues that Power had essentially struck a bargain. He would maintain the public image the studio required, the heterosexual matinee idol who made female moviegoers swoon, while being granted certain private freedoms as long as they remained completely discreet. This arrangement reportedly extended to Power's string of private auditions, a euphemism for meetings with directors or producers that allegedly went beyond professional discussion into more intimate territory. According to Hollywood veterans who spoke candidly with Carson, these connections helped Power secure better roles and more favorable treatment within the studio hierarchy. Johnny admired Power's ability to navigate such treacherous waters, recalled a staff writer who worked on The Tonight Show during the 1970s. He once commented that Power had managed to satisfy both the studio's commercial demands and his own personal inclinations without the crushing psychological burden that destroyed many other actors forced to live complete lies. It wasn't freedom, but it was a workable compromise in an era that offered few options. Power's approach reflected the extraordinarily limited choices available to actors whose sexuality didn't conform to public expectations during Hollywood's golden age. In an era when exposure as gay or bisexual would mean instant career destruction, strategic privacy rather than authentic openness represented the only viable path for many performers. What fascinated Carson about Power's story wasn't just the personal compromises, explained the former producer, but how they illustrated the fundamental hypocrisy of the studio system. The same studios that carefully crafted morality clauses in contracts and promoted their stars as paragons of American values were simultaneously accommodating private arrangements that contradicted those public narratives, as long as those arrangements remained profitable. "I can't act, but I can make men happy." Carson revealed what Ava Gardner whispered to him after the cameras stopped rolling, and why that simple truth made her Hollywood's most dangerously honest star. 7.
News from the gaming table.
Very good. Alberto's having a fantastic time.
It's about time. Last night, that Greek took him for a whole South American jungle.
7. Ava Gardner, raw honesty in a world of pretense. Among the Hollywood legends Johnny Carson interviewed throughout his career, few impressed him with their candor more than Ava Gardner, the stunning actress whose turbulent romances with figures like Frank Sinatra and Howard Hughes generated as much attention as her film performances, possessed a refreshing willingness to acknowledge the realities of how Hollywood really worked, even when those realities contradicted the industry's preferred narratives. According to those close to Carson, Gardner's appearances on The Tonight Show often continued in his office afterward, with the actress sharing unvarnished insights about her experiences in the studio system once the cameras stopped rolling. It was during one of these private conversations that Gardner reportedly made her most famous confession: "I was a terrible actress, but I was great in bed." Johnny believed her, explained a former Tonight Show producer who witnessed their after-hours conversations. Not that she was a terrible actress, Carson actually thought she had genuine talent, but that her early opportunities came more from her extraordinary beauty and willingness to form strategic relationships than from her acting skills alone. What impressed him most was her honesty about this reality, when most stars maintained the fiction that Hollywood was a pure meritocracy. Gardner's candor reportedly stemmed from her background. Unlike many stars who arrived in Hollywood with dreams of artistic expression, Gardner had been discovered when a studio employee saw her photograph in her brother-in-law's photography shop window. This accidental entry into the industry perhaps allowed her to maintain a certain detachment and clarity about how the system actually functioned. Carson saw Gardner as Hollywood's most clear-eyed realist, noted the former NBC executive. He told colleagues she understood from the beginning that the studio system operated on multiple currencies. Talent was one, but physical beauty, sexuality, and strategic relationships were equally important. While other actresses maintained the public fiction that their success was based solely on ability, Gardner privately acknowledged the complex realities of how women advanced in the industry. This pragmatism extended to Gardner's famous relationships with some of the most powerful men in entertainment. According to Carson's private assessments, these weren't merely passionate romances, but often involved complex power dynamics that reflected Gardner's understanding of how influence operated in Hollywood. Her marriages to Mickey Rooney, Artie Shaw, and Frank Sinatra each connected her to men who occupied different positions within the industry's hierarchy. Johnny admired her strategic instincts, recalled a staff writer who worked on The Tonight Show during the 1970s. He believed Gardner was much more calculating than her wild child image suggested. Her relationships with key industry figures weren't random. They reflected a keen understanding of how power worked in Hollywood and how proximity to that power could advance her professional interests. What distinguished Gardner from many of her contemporaries, according to Carson's insights, was her refusal to maintain the pretense that Hollywood operated as a pure meritocracy. While many actresses who had benefited from strategic relationships later rewrote their narratives to emphasize talent over connections, Gardner maintained a refreshing honesty about the multiple factors that had contributed to her success. Carson believed Gardner's honesty made her dangerous to the studio system, explained the former producer. The entire publicity apparatus was built around promoting the idea that stars succeeded purely based on talent and audience response. Gardner's willingness to acknowledge the role that sexuality and relationships played in career advancement threatened that carefully constructed narrative. It's why studios worked so hard to control stars' public statements, and why Gardner's candor was so extraordinary. This honesty extended to Gardner's assessment of her own talents. Unlike many stars who insisted on being taken seriously as artists, regardless of their actual abilities, Gardner maintained a clear-eyed understanding of her strengths and limitations. This self-awareness impressed Carson, who had interviewed countless celebrities with inflated perceptions of their own talents. Johnny found her lack of pretension refreshing, noted the colleague who worked closely with Carson. In an industry built on illusion, Gardner refused to lie to herself about who she was and how she had achieved success. That authenticity made her a fascinating conversationalist, and ironically, a better actress than she gave herself credit for. Her performances had a raw truth that more technically skilled, but less honest actors often lacked. Before he was the king, Clark Gable was Hollywood's most reluctant male escort. Carson revealed the shocking arrangement that launched Gable's career, and why MGM executives called it the best investment we ever made.
I'd like to extend my apology for my conduct of last night.
Oh, but Red.
I was very drunk and quite swept off my feet by your charms.
8. Clark Gable, The King's Secret Apprenticeship. Few Hollywood transformations were more dramatic than Clark Gable's evolution from struggling stage actor to the King of Hollywood, the ruggedly masculine star whose appeal to female audiences made him MGM's most valuable male asset for nearly 2 decades. Behind this remarkable ascent lay a complex story of strategic relationships and pragmatic compromises that Johnny Carson came to understand through his conversations with industry veterans who had witnessed Gable's early career firsthand. He earned every role twice, once on screen, once in private, Carson reportedly told associates when discussing Gable's path to stardom. This observation hinted at what Carson had learned about Gable's early years in Hollywood when the struggling actor allegedly formed beneficial relationships with influential industry figures who could advance his career, including, most notably, a powerful older female producer who took a special interest in the handsome young performer. According to those familiar with Carson's private discussions, he had heard from multiple sources about Gable's relationship with Minna Wallace, a well-connected agent and producer who was the sister of producer Hal Wallace. This relationship reportedly went beyond professional representation to include a personal dimension that significantly accelerated Gable's access to important roles and influential directors. Johnny believed Gable's early career involved strategic compromises that the star later worked hard to erase from his biography, explained a former Tonight Show producer. Based on what he'd heard from Hollywood veterans, Carson understood that Gable's initial break into significant roles came through relationships with powerful industry figures who were attracted to the handsome young actor and willing to use their influence on his behalf. What distinguished Gable's situation from some other cases of strategic relationships was how completely he transcended these early compromises. According to Carson's insights, once Gable achieved genuine star status based on audience response to films like It Happened One Night and Gone with the Wind, he systematically distanced himself from the relationships that had facilitated his initial opportunities, crafting a new narrative that emphasized his talent and audience appeal rather than his industry connections. Carson saw Gable as someone who had made peace with his past without being defined by it, noted the former NBC executive. He told colleagues that Gable had essentially compartmentalized his early career experiences, acknowledging privately what he had done to secure opportunities, while publicly embracing the self-made star narrative that audiences preferred and that better aligned with his screen persona. This ability to reinvent himself reportedly extended to Gable's relationships with studios and directors. According to Hollywood insiders who spoke candidly with Carson, the star's early willingness to accommodate the requests of powerful figures evolved into a much more assertive approach once he had established his commercial value. The young actor who had allegedly been kept on call by certain producers became the established star who could dictate his own terms. Johnny admired Gable's psychological resilience, recalled a staff writer who worked on The Tonight Show during the 1970s. He once commented that Gable had managed to use the system without being corrupted by it, making the compromises necessary to get his foot in the door, but maintaining enough core integrity to become genuinely deserving of the success that followed. Not everyone who made similar early compromises managed that transition as successfully. Gable's approach reflected both the limited options available to aspiring actors during Hollywood's golden age and the extraordinary determination required to achieve lasting success, regardless of how one's career began. In an industry where talent was abundant, but opportunities were tightly controlled by a small group of powerful gatekeepers, strategic relationships often represented the only viable path to significant roles. What fascinated Carson about Gable's story was his transformation from someone who used relationships to advance his career into someone whose talent and appeal made him genuinely deserving of his status, explained the former producer. Unlike some stars who never developed beyond their initial appeal, Gable grew into his opportunities, working relentlessly to improve his craft, developing his unique screen persona, and ultimately becoming so valuable to MGM that any compromises in his past became irrelevant to his present power.